Hi, welcome back to another episode of Wu Says. This is where we get real about the US, China, everywhere and everything in between. I'm Melisa. Idris. With me is Professor Wu Thye, who has been studying US-China relations long before terrorists became headline news. Now, the past couple of episodes, we've been talking about how post-communist countries have rebuilt their economies from essentially one ideology, one market structure to a free market structure. Let's now zoom in on China, which can be argued as a communist country who has probably had the most successful reform of its economy. And what makes China so successful? What makes China such a success story? Let's dive deeper into that. Prof. Wu, I'm going to cite a date that you've mentioned a couple of times in previous episodes, June 4th, 1989. And I wanted to ask you about that date because when we look at that date for China, it's a pivotal date for China. And also in previous episodes, you've talked about how it's a pivotal date for Poland as well. Two countries, one led to elections, the other led to a crackdown. But both post-communist countries now are seen as economic success stories. Let's juxtapose the two. Talk to me about China's journey.
China's turning point had occurred at the end of 1978 when Deng Xiaoping initiated the process of economic reform. Economic reform was seen as achieving the economic prosperity of Japan and Korea, because Singapore and Hong Kong were good examples, but they were too small to really inspire much confidence.
Okay.
But the fact that Japan was able to rise from the ashes of the war to become a global leader really makes a strong impact. So the direction was set in 1978, and Deng Xiaoping recognized that central planning would not work. You need to have free prices, you need to have a private sector, you need to have integrate into a global economy, and you got to keep inflation under control. So direction was clear, and he decided to pursue it through his policy. Like Shenzhen was opened up to engage, to be freely, to buy things, make things, and so freely to the rest of the world. And foreign investments could come in, so internationalization began, but only in some parts of China. And then prices were, a market track was introduced alongside the central plan track. In other words, if you produce above the quota, you can sell it at a market price. Don't have to sell it to the state. So there was elements of free prices, and at the same time, they allowed the rural communities to start up factories, because there was such a shortage of consumer goods in the country. Making shirts, making shoes, you don't need huge, sophisticated factory. All you need is a workshop. And the rural area, because of the agricultural reforms, so prosperity came to the agricultural sector first, so they had money. And so they could start open factories to cater to it. And those were all registered as village-owned factory, because private enterprise was still illegal. But it was no longer owned by the country. It was owned by the local community.
Got it.
So it's localized socialism instead of centralized socialism. And at the same time, he kept good control on the money supply so that inflation was under control. The economy boomed. From 1978 to 1984, the life in the agricultural sector, income went up by at least a factor of 3 per person. And because of the success, they said, why can't we do this same dual track system in the industrial sector? And they open up and boom, it starts going up. What was wrong with this gradual price reform was that there was still the state prices, which means that whoever who had special access to buying the state prices could resell it in the market and that is inflation. In any reforms, corruption undermines the legitimacy of the performance.
Right.
And people saw this corruption of the dual-track price system. The demonstrations that began in Tiananmen in 1989 did not begin as demonstrations against the government. It was not demonstration against the Communist Party. It was a demonstration against inflation and the corruption that people thought was responsible for the inflation. That was how the student riots began. It was about economics and corruption. It was only much later, several months later, when the government did not respond, that the movement morphed into demands for other things.
So it started out as a kind of cost of living
Anti-corruption
protest.
campaign.
Okay. Oh, wow.
That's how it started. And it unfortunately, it then morphed into demands for political changes.
Yeah, yeah.
And at that point in time, the students were advised to go back to campus, but that did not happen. And there was some division at the uppermost level of the party of which direction they should go, what kind of political reforms should they really think about. And the people who decided that the political system is fine the way it is prevail. And so that's when the decision was made to scatter the students from the square and led to some unhappy consequences. So that was followed immediately by a rollback in reforms, a reimposition of state control on the economy. Basically, that was, you could say, the end of the 1978 turning point. So the question was, would June 4th, 1989 be the ending of that turning point, so that it would not be a turning point?
Yeah.
Well, what happened was in August 1991, the Soviet Union had an internal coup in which Gorbachev was overthrown and Yeltsin came to power, and Yeltsin banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by January 1st, 1992. So Deng Xiaoping said, if we do not reform, what has happened in Russia will happen to us.
China.
So in early 1992, Deng Xiaoping went to southern China and he said very clearly, if we do not if we do not continue on the path we had set up in 1978, we will become like Russia today. And China, that argument left the people who had thought everything was fine the way it was, because, as I say, reform is self-revolution. So there were always people who thought central planning would have worked. And central planning, do you know why central planning didn't work? Because I was not totally in charge then. It was Mao who was in charge. It's just like the usual thing you hear among many authoritarians. Do you know why Rome wasn't built in one day? Because I was not in charge then. So
always blame it on the previous guy.
It's like, why didn't central planning succeed? Because I was not in charge. Now we're a new group. We'll work harder. We'll make it work. But these people basically had lost their credibility with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
So the faction that say the direction that Deng Xiaoping has initiated should be continued.
Okay.
So what happened is China immediately allowed private and legalized private enterprises across the board.
Oh, wow.
So all these village registered enterprises basically turn in new registration because
Became
they all were
private
private
entities.
overnight.
Yes.
But what happened was, it's important to realize that in the initial stage, certain institutional forms that appeared will disappear because they were there because of political reasons.
Right.
Just like the dual track price system I talked about. So Deng Xiaoping's realized the problem was corruption. So how could we get rid of the corruption? We stopped the dual track price system. We have only one price. And everybody recognized that this particular system was dangerous to the regime. So total price liberalization came after 1989 because they recognized that this slow approach was not
Working.
was going to lead to more problems.
Okay.
So the important thing is you have to eliminate corruption. That is what the big lesson there was. But the other important difference why China could grow so much was of that China was a backward country that was not yet industrialized. In 1978, only 18% of the population are not 18% population are not farmers. The rest, only 18% are factory workers and government workers.
So
82%
80%
were all farmers.
Okay.
Look at that
Largely
in
rural.
Russia. Russia, less than 7% were farmers. They were all factory workers.
Okay.
And what was the problem? So farming was 8%, 92% are factory workers, and most of the factory workers are making cement and iron, not making textile, shoes, or cars. So to reform means we want to follow the market. We have to make consumer sovereignty to be the guiding force. To make consumer sovereignty the guiding force, consumers want textiles, shoes, cars, washing machine. They don't want to have iron and steel that they cannot eat and they can and basically useless goods. So you have to move workers from heavy production to light production. How do you move people? You let their factories collapse. Then the factories release people and they move on to the new industries. That's why it's very painful because people lose their job and then new light industry starts appearing and then they hire them in gradually. So that's a painful process.
That is a very painful reform.
Process.
Yes.
Same thing in Poland, same thing in Ukraine, where I worked. Basically, all these urbanized countries, regardless of whether they reform quickly, like in Poland, or glacially, like Ukraine, they all collapsed once they marketized. Because they had to move people out from the iron, steel, chemical industry to the light industry.
Is the lesson here that there is no reform without the pain?
No. Depends on the condition in which you start. If things were so bad, then you can only go upwards. Russia and Ukraine were not so bad.
Okay.
In the case of China, you have in the agriculture side, there were too many workers.
Okay, 80%.
82% were farmers. And many of them were underemployed. You could safely take them out and output would not have been declined.
Okay.
But you don't see them because China has the hukou system. They cannot go and live in the urban areas and be beggars.
So there was no kind of urbanization migration at that point in time.
So what happened was when China integrated the global economy, the world wants cheap shoes, the world wants cheap textiles. So China opened new factories and workers came from the countryside to work in these factories. And because these were surplus workers, agriculture output was not compromised. So you only had growth.
Wow.
There was no need to close any heavy industry,
Wow.
to release workers.
Okay.
There was no need to reform the state enterprises because the state enterprises only employ 18% of the population. Whereas the huge growth of the industrial labor force did not come from the state-owned enterprises. They came from the countryside.
That's amazing. So,
And so that's the great boom. They had got all this excess labor that were underemployed. In fact, there was this famous story when they did the census. They go to a rural household and they say, we want to count how many, to count people. And people from the household said, please don't come near. We'll come out to you one by one. And people came out one by one to be counted instead of letting them in. Do you know why? They noticed that every one of them was wearing the same pair of pants. So things were very poor.
oh dear.
Things were very poor.
Oh.
So when jobs opened up in these coastal factories started by Hong Kong businessmen making goods for the rest of the world. So that's when China became a big exporter. And with this export, they could buy foreign technology, and with foreign technology, they could upgrade production.
So you said that China's economic reform, essentially it started 1975.
Eight.
Oh, 78, right. So if it started from that point and it's gone through what we would consider a success, the success of these reforms, has it changed or is it going to change? Do you see them staying on the same trajectory? Is Xi Jinping going to have to change his playbook?
Well, one thing for sure is after the restarting of reforms in 1992, China grew very quickly, as we know. That's what the China miracle is about. But unfortunately, so did corruption in China. So when Xi Jinping came to power, he saw that ultimately this was a threat to the continued high growth of China because people will reject the corruption they see. And when they reject it, they will make trouble. And when they make trouble, the economy would suffer. And he's trying to preempt that from happening. So he has therefore undertook this huge anti-corruption campaign. Many cynics have said this is just to be used against his enemies. I'm sure if you were corrupt and you were his enemy, you were the first in line. But,
You moved up the list.
but basically, it was a very serious effort. And the second thing was, he recognized that because of the rapid rise of China, he could sense insecurity in the US. In other words, open markets may not be such a guaranteed article of faith. In other words, the survival of the WTO system is not guaranteed. And what would one do? One would therefore like to have markets that are outside of the US and friends who are outside of the US. Because he realizes to be isolated is to be condemned to stagnation. Because good ideas occur everywhere in the world and you want to be able to access them when they appear.
That's right.
So he started the One Belt, One Road initiative to make friends with Southeast Asia and Africa in case that if the world changed, China would not be isolated. He did all of this in around 2015 or so because by that time you could already see signs of US discomfort
Right.
with the rise of China. Because George Bush Jr., when he ran for election in 2000, had promised to confront the Chinese threat. That was in 2000. But he did not confront the Chinese threat because of September 11, 2001. So he had to postpone confronting China, and he needed China help when he decided to take down the Taliban government in Afghanistan. So That bought China more time to adjust. And China realizes technology is very important. The question is to have technological improvements. The government has to work with the universities and the private sector. The government has to put in the seed money. So the role of the state has become important in China because it's trying to prevent technological isolation as well.
In this age of tariffs, and you've said before in previous episodes that you see this as the end of free trade. And it's essentially, given Trump's decisions on tariffs for different countries, it's the closer you are to China, the more tariffs you have. How do you think China might adapt to this landscape that we're operating in, this new global economy?
I think that the rest of the world, like Malaysia, Europe, Japan, Korea, would like to keep free trade among ourselves. In other words, if we have faced all these tariffs with the US, we deal with those tariffs. But among ourselves, we should practice free trade. The question is, or are we going to follow the Americans and say, anybody who's China's friend, 40% on them? Would the Americans be able to pressure Malaysia to put tariffs on Chinese goods? And should Malaysia agree? Or should all of us collectively say, yes, we will pay 19% to the US, but among ourselves, we will keep the WTO system. If that can be achieved, then we will have a significant amendment of the WTO system, but not total elimination of it.
What do you think China would do?
China, of course, would want to be part of this global free trade system.
Okay.
Because then it would be the undisputed leader. Because the other leader doesn't want to be the leader of free trade.
Right.
And this is very ironical because China has been, in many ways, not fulfilled its promises under WTO. That is why it makes the Americans also so unhappy. China had promised to undertake a whole slew of market opening under WTO, which it has not done. But now it was willing to do it in order to become the leader of the rest of the world minus the US. That's a price that you will willingly pay.
Wonderful. Okay, and that will end on that note for our look at China. Thank you so much, Prof. Wu, for giving us some insight into the Chinese history of economic reform. I appreciate your time. Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of Wu Says, where we get real about the US, China, everywhere and everything in between. Join us for another episode next week. See you then. Bye-bye.